This is Jordan Tower with JT News. Make sure you smash that like button, smash that subscribe button. Okay, so they're about 3 hours into the trial, so let's go tap in and see what's going on there. This is day 7 of the Diddy trial, okay? And they're going to have more witnesses, obviously, today. Roger Bonds, other people have been brought up. Cassie, assistants are basically confirming everything Cassie said. And, this whole trial seems to revolve around Cassie. I remember an interview with Joe Tacopina where he was saying, if I was Diddy's lawyer, I would have settled when it first came across your desk, because you don't want something like this getting out of control. None of this would have happened if he had just settled in the beginning. So it's day 7, personal assistant through exotic dancer to Cassie's mother and a chef is coming on today. Before the jurors come in, Diddy's lawyer, this is Angolfino, one of his 10 lawyers, they opposed David James testifying about the incident with Suge Knight. He's going to mention D-Rock. Says he was a friend of Biggie Smalls. That's decades ago, not relevant. Judge says, seems like you're previewing your cross. Witness/personal assistant David James takes the stand. The judge says, good morning, welcome back. Courtroom deputy says, we are missing 4 jurors. It may be the subways. Jurors have belatedly arrived. The government says, what about physical violence between Mr. Combs and Cassie? Did you personally observe it? James says, no, I did not. Government says, do you remember a blog post? He says, yes, I was in L.A. when he came back from a club. Government says, what did Mr. Combs say? He says that someone was lying on him, saying he hit Cassie at the club. He went through my browser history. No one had ever done that to me. Government says, did Mr. Combs give you instructions about Cassie? He says, to bring her food at the London hotel, some Roscoe's. What is Roscoe's? Some delicious fried chicken in Los Angeles. Then he says, what did you do for Mr. Combs in New York? I bring him applesauce, Jell-O, Fiji water, his toiletry bag with ointments just for men. We bought 40 items so he wouldn't call us later. We brought 40 items so he wouldn't call us later. I'd get a key, like at the Trump International. And then he says, I'd set up the medicine bag and the personal LV bag. I think it was an IV bag, though. What was in it? A Viagra, ecstasy, perks. Okay, so it was an LV bag. He says, How did you go about replenishing these supplies? He says, I'd used my personal credit card. Bad boy paid me back. Government, who paid you back? Usually Bonds, that security guy that's been making his rounds on Vlad and everything. Did Mr. Combs ever stay alone in the hotel? He says, never. Usually Cassie, sometimes other women. Government, did he ask you to bring things during his stay? He says, he texts me for an iPod or food. He says, did anything strange ever happen? He says, yes. In Miami, he asked for an iPod from his house on Star Island. I drove it to his hotel and knocked. No one answered. I had a key. I'd set it up in his room. What'd you see? Says Cassie on the bed. Where there was another person who sort of scurried away and the shower was on. I thought Mr. Combs was in there. Government, how was she sleeping? He says, she was on her back. Then he said, objection, sustained. He says, what about the other person? He was about 5'8" with long hair and large endowment. He scurried away. Did you ask anything? He says, I wasn't hired to ask about personal affairs. Did you ever pick up drugs from Mr. Combs? He says, yes, Percocets at a pharmacy, sometimes in my name. Did you give him permission to use your name? He says, I don't recall that. Was there a drug dealer? He says, yes, one stop. He met with a lot of other people? Yes. Even former presidents. Which one? Former President Obama. Was it your understanding would have happened if you hadn't done these things? Oh, what was your understanding? What would happen if you hadn't done these things? He says, and they say objection, sustained. Did you ever take ecstasy? Yes. I was drinking Ciroc. I took ecstasy. I was Diddy bopping. What do you mean? I was vibing. Did you speak with Mr. Combs about it? He says, he was reviewing footage of the party. He had a videographer who filmed the parties. He asked me, hey, Playboy, was that you dancing around the party? I said, yes. And he says, I'm going to keep the video in case I ever need it. Meaning, the government says, meaning that I'd be embarrassed. Then the government says, did anything ever go missing? He says, they said a bracelet was missing. Uncle Polly came to my hotel room and searched my belongings and those of my girlfriends at the time. Could you have said no? They said objection. Move on. Then the government says, did you ever take a lie detector test? He says, yes. Government says, who was present? He says, just me and this gentleman. He was very intimidating. They put monitors on my head, my chest, and my hand. Could you refuse? He says, no, I had to do this to keep my job. Then the government says, did this happen again? He says, yes, when Mr. Combs said a watch from his collection had been stolen. What was the result, they say? He says, the gentleman told me I seemed nervous. I said, sure I am. Government says, once Capricorn Clark had to take a lie detector test to prove she wasn't part of a heist in Mr. Combs' jewelry. Wow. Then he says, the government says, was there an incident at Mel's Diner with Suge Knight? He says, yes, I drove a silver Navigator to get cheeseburgers there. Then he says, D-Rock said, that's Suge Knight. He went over and says, what's up? Suge didn't recognize him. D-Rock said, I'm Biggie's boy. Then he says, what happened next? They say, we noticed 4 black SUVs to different sides of the parking lot. He said, I saw someone hand Suge Knight a gun. D-Rock said, we got to get out of here. We drove back to the house. What did you find there? He says, Cassie was crying. Mr. Combs got in the vehicle. I saw 3 guns in his lap. Dave James, I felt calm because we'd been in a silver vehicle. Now we're in a black one. They wouldn't see us coming. What did you find at Mel's Diner? He says, Suge Knight had left. Mr. Combs said, drive around the block. What did you decide? Then he says, to leave the company. They offered me other positions, but I just wanted to leave. My life was at risk. Then the government says, no further questions. Judge says, Mr. Angolfino. Combs' lawyer says, you didn't tell all this the first time. Then he says, David James says, they told me to stop, to not say anything or that would incriminate me. Then the Combs' lawyer says, look at the notes from your interview. Read it yourself, and then look at me. David James says, okay. How'd you recognize Suge Knight? David James says, I listened to hip-hop. Then the guy says, were you drinking or smoking pot? David James says, no, sir. Says, your mind was clear? He says, as clear as it could be working 20 hours a week at 4 a.m. And then Combs' lawyer says, D-Rock opens the door. Suge Knight is a few cars over. He says, David James says, window was open. David James says, D-Rock says, David James says then, he says, D-Rock says, I'm Biggie's boy. Then Suge recognizes him, gives him a dab. They say, what's a dab? A handshake. And he says, did you leave D-Rock at the diner? Why are you smiling? And he says, because that's a crazy question. Why would I? And he says, didn't you leave D-Rock at the diner? He says, that makes no sense. Then he says, I'm not asking what makes sense. I'm asking you, did you? He says, no. Then he says, you saw Cassie and Mr. Combs? He says, yes, Mr. Combs told me to drive. And then he says, you don't know where Mr. Combs got the guns, do you? He says, I didn't know we had guns until then. And then he says, have you ever been in a situation like that? He says, no. Then he says, you didn't say, hey, I don't want to drive Suge Knight with guns. He says, no. Then he says, what what exactly did you do before you got this job? And he says, I was a door-to-door salesman, then a personal assistant. He says, now you're going to go with guns to confront someone? And he says, it was not ideal. You knew how to get to Mel's Diner, right? He says, I frequently went there. And he says, have you seen guns before, right? He says, no. He says, this is a radical departure from your job description. Is that an understatement? He says, it's an understatement of the day so far. Then he says, do you have immunity? David James says, ask my lawyer. I have some kind of an offer agreement. Then they say a proffer. And he says, and then he says, you didn't tell anyone about this? And he says, only my wife. He says, did you meet with the government this morning? And he says, yes, briefly, about what might come up in Cross. Then he says, did the Mel's Diner incident come up? And he says, not that I recall. And he says, it's this morning. What did you talk about? He says, your style. And then laughs. I'm dying to ask what they said, but I won't. Then he says, I have a few more questions, so a few more mundane questions. And David James says, I love mundane questions. He says, where did you travel with Mr. Combs? He says, Ibiza, London, St. Tropez. He says, were these vacations? He says, business oriented. What were you hired as? And he says, a personal liaison, but I was a personal assistant. He met a high level of a roster of people. He says, second understatement of the day. And he says, why? He says, he met with a who's who. Then Combs' lawyer says, it was important that he prep for these meetings, right? And he says, yes. And he says, it was important to be on time. And he says, no, we change meetings to fit his schedule all the time when he didn't want to show up at a certain time. And then they say, he had security because he wanted people because people wanted to touch him, right? He says, yes, in the airport, in McDonald's. He says, was he gracious? I don't think gracious is a word I'd use for Diddy. Then Diddy's lawyer says, did he sign autographs? He says, no. Then he says, you said he'd stay in the studio till 3 or 4 a.m. and you'd stay with him. And he says, yes, it was common. And he says, what sort of things would he want to always have with him? He says, ketchup, for example. Did you know that he put applesauce on cheeseburgers? He says, no, but I knew he liked applesauce. And then he says, he liked it alongside condoms and baby oil, but didn't expense. Wait. He liked Astroglide, condoms, and baby oil, but you didn't expense it through business? He says, usually not. He says, I was told that he didn't want to run them through the company. He didn't want to record them. Then Combs' lawyer says, when you brought the 8-ball of Coke in St. Tropez, you didn't tell Mr. Combs, did you? He was asleep. Just tell me about your relationship with Roger Bonds. He says, we talked about Bad Boy Family. He says, what do you mean? The government says. He says, Mama Combs called me her son many times. And he says, what was the mission? He says, to make sure he's happy. I wonder if this is the guy that I used to know. There was an assistant at Diddy's. Diddy went through assistants a lot. But there was one time when I had to deal with Diddy on a DVD thing. David James. Diddy assistant. I can't find what this guy looks like. He was a small person. Seems like a... Nah, this isn't the same guy. That guy must have been before this guy. Anyways, then he says, was it fun? David James enjoyed it all the time. Okay, then he says, tell me about your relationship with Roger Bonds. Then they says, what was his mission? Mama Combs called me her son many times. What was the mission? To make sure Diddy's happy. Was it fun working for Diddy? He says, I enjoyed it from time to time. Then he says, what was your relationship with Chef Jordan? And he says, very professional. He says, did you choke her? He says, no. And then he says, objection, sidebar. What? And then he says, tell me what happened. He says, we were on Star Island and she told me where to take him. I grabbed her 2 wrists and said, stay in your effing lane. What was the fallout? And Dave James says, it was reported to corporate HQ that Mr. Combs called me in. Then Mr. Combs told me, you can't be putting your hands on women. He told me to give her a gift. And he says, what'd you give her? He says, I rolled up a blunt and gave it to her. Did she like it? It appeared she did. Wow. So this guy's an aggressive assistant. Stay in your lane. I'll tell him where to go. That's weird. David James. I didn't smoke when working with Mr. Combs, but he caught you smoking once. He says, I thought he was in for the night. I lit it up. He came out and he says, what are you doing? I said, nothing. And he said, if you're man enough to smoke, you're man enough to tell me. I said, okay, I'm smoking. He says, if I did it again, he'd fire me. He says, how about when you picked up 2 prostitutes and had sex with one? Objection. Wow. Jeez. Then judge overruled, and he says, she asked for $200. I called Bonds and asked, what the hell? She asked to take a shower. I said, that's $200. Then Combs' lawyer says, on that note, no further questions. Jeez. This personal assistant's a little train wreck, isn't he? Which one is the personal? Oh, it's this guy. Then they take a break. Is that it for now? Oh no. Then we got Reggie Ventura comes in. Judge says, I'm going to get the temperature turned up in here. I'm told it's complicated, but I'm freezing right along with you. The government calls Regina Ventura. They say, where do you live? She says, New London, Connecticut. How many children do you have? 2. Roderick, Cassandra. Who is this? She says, Sean Combs. He dated my daughter. This is the government asking her questions. When did you meet Mr. Combs? She says, 2006, my daughter signed with Bad Boy Records. He was her boss. They started dating. They moved to L.A. Read this message in December 2011. She says, Cassandra wrote me. She said Combs threatened to release sex tape and go after her and Mr. Muscuddy, Kid Cudi, as we know. Let's see. Then she says, how'd you react? She says, it made me sick. Sean Combs demanded $20,000. He said, to recoup losses due to Kid Cudi from my now husband and myself. Why did you take a loan to pay Sean Combs? She says, for the safety of my daughter. What? Did he really want 20 grand? What? Yo, Diddy's a weird person, bro. What? These are the photos I took of my daughter's bruises from Sean Combs. Did he deserve to... Think about this. To recoup losses due to Kid Cudi. Mr. Muscuddy is Kid Cudi, right? Yeah. Listen. Did he deserve to lose that $20 million? You don't think so? Penalty. You cheated on me. We were in the kitchen laughing. Sean asked her why she was laughing. She stopped and looked plain. Okay, so do you know Mia? She says, yes, she was an employee of Sean Combs. What happened? We were in the kitchen laughing. Sean asked her why she was laughing. She stopped and looked plain. Now to August 2016, we're done with the binder. While in L.A., did you call police? He says, yes. Sean Combs stole Cassie's phone. They had a bitter argument outside an apartment building. She lived on 17th floor. They argued at the roundabout. Who else was there? She says D-Rock. Is Damian Butler in government name? His government name? She says, yeah, he was standing between us. I tried to hit him. Sean Combs took Cassandra's car, a Jaguar. No further questions. Judge Cross, defense says no questions. And then they say, next witness. The government calls. So that was Cassie's mom. That was quick. Next witness. The government calls Mr. Shereé Hayes. Where are you from? He says, Harlem, New York. What was your work? He says, a male exotic dancer. I'm known as the Punisher. He says, do you recognize these two? He says, yeah, that's Diddy and Cassie Ventura. I was hired in 2012 to create a sexy erotic scene for them. Why are you called the Punisher? The government asks. He says, playing basketball on West 4th Street. He says, the woman who called you, what time did she book for you? He said, midnight at the Trump Tower, Central Park West, striptease for a small group of friends. When you got there, how did Miss Ventura appear? He says, in the bathroom with nothing underneath and a wig. I was expecting a crowd, but there was no one else. She told me she and her husband wanted to create a sexual scene with baby oil. What did she hand you? He says, $800. How was the room? He says, dimly lit, electric candles, bowl of water with bottles of baby oil in them. She told me not to acknowledge her husband, not to look at him when he came around. Did he come out? He says, yes, he was naked, but I could see his face. And he was like what a Muslim woman wears. Like, you can only see the eyes. He had a bottle of Astroglide. How'd you recognize it? He says, I use it. Purple top. And then he says, how did it end? He says, she went into the other room with him, and she came back and asked if I wanted to finish. I said no. If they were happy, I was happy. She gave me more money. Did you do it again? She said, yes, like 8 or 12 times. She went in the other room with him. When she came back, she asked if I wanted to finish. What? How did you end up recognizing her? He says, I was a fan of Mr. Combs and followed him on Instagram. I saw her on it. This would be a good place to break. They break. Oh, the Punisher. This is crazy. Yeah, Diddy kind of brought this on himself. I mean, Diddy did bring it this on himself. We know that, right? Anyways, we'll get more into this as the day comes to an end. This is Jordan Tower with JT News. I'll smash you. They're cruising through this case. This case is going to be over quick, man. Couple more weeks. I couldn't even see a couple more weeks. I could see like 2 more weeks after this week. But maybe I'm wrong. You know, they tend to drag things out, you know. Anyways, it's Jordan Tower with JT News. Peace.